In this video, we're going to take a look at Pilot 100th Anniversary Red. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This red has a ton of color variation. Tons. Like it's an entirely different ink sometimes. But I don't mind it in this case. It can shade, but not in any kind of real standout way. I don't see this being an ink you're going to run to for its shading, but for its color and tones that it does give. It's not always a bad thing that it doesn't shade. For instance, I find with black inks as well as red inks, I like solid tones all the way through the writing and don't enjoy the shading as much. Strangely, for as much as I enjoy shading, but red and black, you're going to go ahead and break the rules. I'm not bothered to have a bottle of this ink, which was how I actually purchased it against my normal get a sample first feeling. And that was because I really kind of needed a red other than garnet, which was funny because I kind of really enjoy using this ink. Not quite as much as I enjoy using the garnet, but almost as much, which was very surprising to me as someone that doesn't tend to enjoy very red or very red leaning inks. But this one has just enough of that kind of magenta lean in what's going on that I really do like this color, despite everything that I should not like about it, like it being a red or it not shading. I still really like it. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today, that pen is a Jinhao 51A with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine has no feather, no spread. We see a couple moments of shading, like in the word friendship, where we see also of is darker than the word a right next to it. We see so gets from darker to lighter. It's not too bad here, even though I don't care for how it looks. I'd like it to be a more solid tone. Medium is darker than the fine with no feathering, no spread. We are still getting a little bit of shading going on if you like shading in your red inks. You do get to see it where A is lighter than the word few. His is darker than the word new, which is a nice mid-tone. I wish all of it came as that word right there. The broad is super dark, much darker than everything else on the page. It has no feather, no spread, no shading. It is, as itself as a color, amazing to look at. This really is great. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get minor ghosting and no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a TWSBI Vac Mini with a fine nib, a Pilot Vanishing Point with a medium nib, a TWSBI Vac 700 with a Fountain Pen Revolution broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine, we get no feather, no spread, we get no real shading. Something I do notice is it is quite a bit lighter in tone than we saw with the Clairfontaine. It almost has a kind of pink look to it, like it's pink leaning very red, which is kind of interesting. I don't care for it, but it is interesting here. I think it's a response to the paper being a little more absorbent and toned. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, no shading happening here. I like this tone much better. I think this is really a great red here, but a better red is what we're getting with the broad. Now, unfortunately, there is a little bit of feathering when you see it on the word was, the word given, the word the. Tiny feathers do occur all over, but this is a very wet, broad pen. Now, it has no spread and it has no shading. Its tone is really nice. I really appreciate this tone. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get a lot of ghosting as would be expected. We see the broad really was working its way to come through the page, but it never touched the page on the other side. So while you can't use the back of the page with the broad, you don't corrupt the page underneath. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine, we get no feather, no spread. We get that same pink leaning red, not really pink, definitely a red, pink leaning. So it's not as offsetting for me a color in how it's coming through as it was with the Leuchtterm. We're getting moments of shading. You see in the H of there is a little bit of shading that is occurring. The L in later. So there is a couple spots which, again, I don't care for in red. Medium is darker than the fine with a couple of moments in the writing. You're going to see later the word effrontery has tiny feathers in it, but not really a big deal. So, not something to worry about. We get no real shading here, which is not too bad. The broad is the darkest tone on the page. It's not having any feathering, no spread, no shading, just a very pleasant tone. And when we look at the back of the page, we do see that we get the normal amount of ghosting, we get no bleed through, and nothing touches the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We are seeing some shading that's going on. You see he starts darker, gets lighter. You see with starts lighter, gets darker. So there is some shading that occurs. But as has been common with this paper, there is some tone change that goes on with this ink. This really does look like it is a pink ink while writing with a fine nib on this paper. The medium is darker than the extra fine, and it is a red. It looks like it's an entirely different ink. It has no feather, no spread. I see almost no shading. There's only 1 or 2 spots where it pokes out some. Otherwise, it's a solid performing red here. Better performing red is what we get with the broad. It has no feather, no spread, much darker in tone. Absolutely a great true red on this paper. This is an entirely different ink depending on what paper it's on. It's really doing amazing things, and I am enjoying what I'm getting for the colors. Now, looking at the back of the page, we see that we get a normal amount of ghosting, but no bleed through. Nothing touches the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Colorverse Red Shift. Here is Diamine Monaco Red. Here is Monteverde Ruby. Here is Sailor Kobe number 4. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feathering, which is always surprising with this paper. We get no spread. We actually do see some shading that's going on. You see achievements starts much darker than it ends. You see the word the is much darker than the word first. Something else you're also going to notice is it is much more pink in tone. And I think that is really just an absorbent paper thing. I think with the absorbent papers, we're seeing much more of a pink come out, which if you like, great. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. It is shading, and it's shading with pink and red. So if you see existence is very red as a word, the word underneath it, roots, starts more pink and works its way more red. So I'm not liking it here, but I do think its performance is rather interesting. The broad has the darkest tone on the page by far, a nice dark, rich red. Unfortunately, it is feathering. Fortunately, all of the feathers are really tiny and kind of manageable for what this paper is. No shading whatsoever, just a beautiful, dark, rich red. Looking at the back of the page, we see we get normal ghosting, not such a problem. We kind of would have expected little bleed spots to occur with the broad, but there was no bleeding that touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Caran d'Ache, their Chromatics Magnetic Blue. Here is a turquoise ink by Diamine, their Marine. Here is a black ink by Monteverde, Midnight Black. Here is a green ink by Robert Oster, their Forest Green. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get feathering, really small feathering in comparison to some of the other writing that's been done here. We do get a tiny bit of spread, but this is a finer fine and it looks just like a fine. That's a lot of fines to say all at once. It's actually, I think, performing really well on this very cheap paper, even though it does have some feathering and some tiny spread. It's got no shading whatsoever. It is very much a pink leaning tone here. Not my favorite of things that's happening. Not that I have a problem with pink inks, but that's not the pink I would want. The medium is much darker than the fine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not have shading. It does look red though. The broad, yes, it feathers a lot. Yes, it spreads a lot. Yes, it is much darker than everything else on the page. It looks flat. While I've really enjoyed the darkest tones on the other papers, this red looks kind of flat to me. It doesn't look like it's really demanding of any attention. Looking at the back of the page, you can see the one spot I circled where it did touch the page underneath, surprisingly with the medium and not the broad. Otherwise, we get a normal amount of ghosting and only that one spot that bleed through and touch the underneath. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? With all the color variation, this is a tough one for me. I seem to be liking all of them, but while I like the very dark tone that I'm getting with the wet broad, I actually prefer the thinner letters that I'm getting with the fine. So I think the best way for me to go would be with a very wet fine pen, but a very wet, because I want that very dark, rich tone that this ink can have to offer. Not that I don't like it from a fine pen, but I'm not appreciating that pink lean that I'm seeing. Thanks for watching.